So today I'm doing something a bit unique for the channel. I've invited a good friend of mine who runs a blog called The Stranger Beyond the Gate on for a discussion. Our discussion touched on a wide variety of topics, ranging from Christianity, its relationship to the modern world, its particular relationship to secularism, just how much of what we take for granted comes to us from Christianity, issues, problems facing Christianity in the future, and some differences between East Asian culture and European culture. If any of these topics interest you, I highly recommend you go over and read the blog, The Stranger Beyond the Gate. But without further ado, here is our discussion. A Stranger Beyond the Gate. It deals with issues of contemporary culture, philosophy, and particularly all through a Christian perspective. So do you want to just give a quick rundown of what it is your blog's about? What is the message behind it? What inspired you to start writing?
Yeah, so initially my blog was about scholarship and specifically on historical critical scholarship. So topics of interest include like ancient Near Eastern archaeology, textual criticism, early church history. So it's very, very academic and not so much related to confessional Christian faith. And the reason why I started this blog was because at the time I was processing a lot of my church experiences, and I wanted to have a sort of overview of my faith. And you could say it's a bit like a faith crisis at that time, and it went on for almost 10 years actually, from when I was maybe 16, 17. And through this whole period, it was just searching for either church or, if I can't find it in the church, a worldview from the outside, finding meaning in my life. And scholarship was helpful up to that point. But the fact that I was reading all these things and they tend to jump disciplines quite a lot. And I eventually veered into history and politics. And I think a third change that happened was me coming to the UK and observing the very different society in the UK compared to back home. And I don't just mean cultural customs, but also the kind of behavior, the social political consciousness of Britain. Mm-hmm. And what I felt but couldn't quite articulate for the first maybe 3 years in the UK was that the UK has Christian instincts, even though faith has, to a very large extent, departed from the church. Departed from the UK.
And the church in some places, yeah.
Yeah, very much, yeah. Yeah, so I think that was a bit of a reawakening for me, because I observed how Christianity had a sort of unconscious, a sort of unconscious, I can't find the term right now. It has an afterlife. Mm-hmm. It has a certain afterlife in society, and Christian instincts can inform the moral values of a certain society long after, yes, it has faded from that culture. Mm-hmm. So that was how I actually got back into the Christian faith, me leaving the church, and then realizing that a lot of the values that made me leave, at that time I was very, very progressive, like politically. A lot of these values, although they have been detached and in some ways corrupted from the Christian faith, but they very much, their core instincts are Christian. And it was a journey tracing backwards through history and political history as well, how Christianity informed these values. Yeah, I guess that's how my blog came into its current existence. So the first focus was scholarship, but this led me to my own political views as a liberal, But then how this idea of liberalism have their roots in Christianity, and that actually made me a bit more conservative over the past year or so, moving back in time and finding my Christian roots.
So it sounds like when you came to Britain, you found a kind of a residue of sort of thousands of years, 1,400, 600 years of Christianity culturally and enshrined in institutions. Although, the layperson, it may not be a huge concern of them. Do you think it gave you a deeper appreciation for Christianity institutionally compared to what you had before?
Certainly. Yeah, absolutely. In fact, absolutely. It was the fact that it was what the philosopher René Girard said, that we use Christianity to criticize Christianity. So it's finding Christianity in post-Christian political systems. So we talk about liberalism or even socialism. You can see hints of Christian ideas there. Right, for socialism, the core value right there is the notion of equality. And this is something unprecedented in Western societies before Christianity came about. So if you see the Greeks and the Romans, they believe in a natural hierarchy it's really a natural hierarchy of people. I use natural in quotation marks because that's what they believed. But even in modern Britain, for example, people would believe in equality before the law, and things like multiculturalism, tolerance. Whether or not we agree with these principles, they do assume that idea of equality for all, and it's not necessarily present in other cultures. I'm ethnic Chinese, and if you look at China for most of its history until maybe the modern period, the idea of equality is largely absent. In fact, it's almost completely absent. There was always this sense of hierarchy. It's there in Confucian thought, for example.
Yeah, and it seems often when you speak to people who are left-wing liberals, leftists, some socialists, very often they have a deep poverty in their understanding of Christian history, and even just in philosophy. It doesn't even have to be a particularly Christian philosophy, and yet they implore so much of its values and many of its presuppositions, but they don't possess a literacy to understand where they come from and the reasoning for why they're there.
Yes.
I think a video of mine you mentioned in our last message, I was talking about issues of inequality and issues of environmentalism. And there's this issue in environmentalism where they talk about sustainability. And if we really wanted to sustain a kind of infinite growth of humans on the planet, we could turn, the whole world into one massive bioengineered biome where we just grew plants in massive skyscrapers under UV lights, and that would be completely sustainable and we wouldn't pollute the atmosphere. But that's obviously not what a lot of people who are environmentalists have in mind. Although the argument is always, well, the only it's about humans. We're destroying the environment so we can't continue to exist and thrive. But if all our thriving is just consumer products and material wealth and material pleasures, what's really the point in it? So a lot of people they can be leftists, socialists, atheists, they suddenly become a kind of Christian steward when it comes to the environment, and yet they have no higher value to appeal to. Obviously, some of them have bizarre pagan beliefs, or they have kind of New Age spiritualist beliefs, but even them, they don't have a strict metaphysical objectivist worldview. They have a very individualistic, subjective, intuitive kind of spiritualism, which itself is a commodity, is a kind of consumer product of themselves.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
So there's so many, and I think this is, there's so many objections from left-wing liberals, from leftists, that they ring so true to so many people because they have the kind of moral authority of the transcendent views of Christianity, sort of transcendent truths within Christianity.
Yeah.
They steal the moral truth from that, but they have no orthodoxy or framework in order to see the consequences of that. And that's a big. I don't know if that's something that was influenced you in coming back to Christianity, but in terms of my view and my progression, that's a big question, a big problem that really sparks and still sparks a resolution that's needed for that.
Yeah, I feel you completely. They have a Christian worldview, or more accurately, they have a worldview that is derived and necessarily inspired by Christianity. But the epistemic foundations are simply not there. Right? It's really standing upon sand, right? Building a house upon sand, to use the biblical metaphor. And it's interesting that you mentioned all these things like environmentalism, right, and socialism, sustainability, and all these ideas can be traced back to the Christian faith, right? I think what's more poignant and very, very striking for me is I came from Singapore, right? It's obviously not a Western culture, and ideas of equality are not as deeply rooted as in the West. Ideas of freedom are not as deeply rooted. And if you see political commentators in Asia, they would just say things like, oh, these are Western values. And they either like it or they dislike it, but they don't see the history of thought. They don't trace it back to its roots. They will just say this is a Western development. And you can't really blame them, because I think a lot in the West, they do follow a certain historiography of thought, which is that Christianity, far from being a force for these social political advancement, Christianity is very much that which keeps things backwards. And the Greeks and the Romans were somehow more advanced, more civilized, and Christianity came along and sort of kept it down for a long time. And then the Enlightenment and the Renaissance came about, and that's when the West had this revival of its civilization. I found that so ironic, because when I took a look back at Greek and Roman culture, and not just the Greeks and the Romans, but also the ancient Near East, which I'm very interested in, is the primary focus of critical scholarship. And I never saw this idea of equality, nor ideals of freedom. They simply aren't there. And I think that was very striking. And looking at Asia as well, coming from an Asian background, look at countries like China, countries like India, hierarchy is the norm. In India, you have those Hindu castes. And of course, modern Hindus, they would argue that, the caste system has evolved. At various times it got better, at various times it got worse. But that very answer betrays the fact that the caste system was still there. It never got completely eliminated. While Christianity completely subverted some of these structures, such as the ancient family, which was one of the blog posts you've read earlier. Right. I guess these are my thoughts. It's very striking seeing so many cultures having been to many places. I've gone to the Middle East as well. I've gone to Israel. I've gone to Palestine, given recent news. I've gone to Egypt, I've gone to Morocco. I can say that the way they live their lives, whatever equality and freedom that they have, it's very much derived from the West in the sense that due to Western dominance over the past few centuries, they they are unconscious heirs to that tradition as well, but it's filtered and in a way corrupted.
Yeah,
While their original culture is not like this.
that's such a fantastic way of putting it. It does, to many in the West, they do experience their heritage through this filter. And it's kind of this filter that everyone since like yesterday, or everyone since before the 1950s was basically an idiot. And that the human problems that they faced, they were not capable of dealing with the moral instincts that we have. And it is. Another YouTuber, he says, the historiography is like a 3-act play. It starts with the Crusades. Its middle act is capitalist colonialists, and then the final act is, he says, well-dressed Germans. And it's this view, rather than the whole idea of even Western society, Western civilization, it really is a product of particularly the Catholic Church. You know, and you can, even before the schism, you can see something particular developing. And of course that has antecedents in the Roman Empire and the division in the Roman Greek East, West. But like so much we take, the institution of adoption, hospitals, the fact that Europe was even politically unified is a product of the Crusades. You know, without that, vast parts of Europe would have been colonized by Arabs and would be Muslim and ethnically Arab.
Yeah.
So the whole idea of Europe, even as a distinct entity, politically, ethnically, religiously, has been birthed through the institution of the church. The church fathers the nations underneath it. And it's like, I don't know if you've seen, there's another YouTuber that talks about the prevalence of certain sexual identities within the ancient world.
Yeah.
There's another kind of mythos, like the idea that they were incredibly tolerant and open to all these things when, you know, all these societies that are claimed to be like that had death penalties for all kinds of conduct that they saw as not appropriate. You know, and even the history of the Inquisition, disregarding the Spanish Inquisition, they had very little legal authority. And for people who are non-Christian, I understand there's some hesitancy around it, but if you genuinely believe someone's soul is in danger, it's of utmost importance to compassionately rehabilitate. So there's not even and obviously if you're not a Christian, you would reject that, you'd understand that. But there's not even a kind of understanding of the context in which they exist and what came before. So it does feel like many in the West, this modern progressive historiography, it denies the roots of the West, and part of that is denying Christianity and its central role in the formation of the West, even ethnographically. Obviously, people are descended from societies that existed before Christianity, but to a large extent, even the ethnographic formation of Europe as a distinct group of people is fathered underneath the authority of the church.
Yes, absolutely. I was reading about this would you believe it, just yesterday, and it's in Larry Seidentop's book, Inventing the Individual, right? And it was very interesting because he really just traced the history of Christianity at the point of at the inception, where it's still under the Roman Empire, and he gave a bit of context on the Greco-Roman societies. Then he moved into Christianity and how things progressively transformed. And it was not as if all these gains were made in the past 200 years. It was actually gains that were made right at the start. For example, you see religious freedom in the church father Tertullian, right? And he actually had this phrase, I can't remember the exact quote, but he did mention that even though we know that these other religions, they are of the devil or of demons, but yet individuals through their own conscience should be able to choose what they believe without any social repercussion for the fact that you believe in that. It's a choice, right? And it's not stated in a way that's very vague. It's not as if it's just a hint of an idea that would lead to the religious freedom we now know. It was very explicit, this idea of freedom of conscience and freedom of association. And simply not...
Well, no, I'll just interject. This is so different from Islam. I mean, Islam, it doesn't have... Christianity, your confession, it has to be authentic. So a Christian can understand that you might say all the words, but if you're forced at the point of violence, it's not authentic, and your soul is not really saved. This doesn't track in Islam. Islam views forced violent conversions as legitimate, so it almost has a magical element to it. That it's a spell. As long as you say the words, you say the shahada, as long as you observe the customs, the law, then it's almost immaterial. Although some would disagree, but it's almost immaterial whether it's authentic in your heart. So that idea of pluralism, it understands a kind of a dignity of an individual to a degree that so many Westerners just assume every religion has. And they're so ignorant of how particular it is to Christianity, how unique it is to Christianity.
Yeah, it is. Yeah.
And there's another thing, so many Westerners think that all other figures in religions are basically Jesus. They go to school, they learn all these facts in religious education. What's the floor plan of a mosque? What's Diwali? They learn all these factoids, but there's this kind of pluralist assumption underneath that basically all religious figures are Jesus, just with cultural differences. And it's different, Muhammad was a warlord. The Buddha, I mean, he may not have even wanted to be regarded religiously. He's a philosopher. He has a very different relationship to truth than Christ does. So it's just, it feels like the Christian influence and the Western influence, they're so powerful among Westerners. They don't see them. It's like a fish being in water.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with that. It's also the fact that our concept of religion is very much a Christian one, while other religions simply have a far more different structure. For example, Islam, right, is as much a political system as it is a religion. It has always been, since the very start, a sort of top-down religion, right? Even the Christians or the Jews, they may be people of the book, but when they are operating within an Islamic society, they can still be Christians or Jews, but they have to abide by the laws as set out by the Islamic authorities. Right? And so this concept of the secular is quite alien to traditional Islamic thought. And I don't deny that there are secular countries in Islam right now, such as Malaysia or Lebanon. But if you look closely, they often don't work very well. There's often some Islamic influence, right? In Malaysia, you have that. And in Lebanon, I mean, secularism is just a complete disaster because the way they think, the way the Muslims think, is a different paradigm. I'm not saying it's right or wrong, it's just a different worldview of how society should be organized. And this idea of secularism, it's a Christian idea. You can trace it back to St. Augustine when he talked about distinguishing between the city of God and then also the saeculum, which is the secular, right? There are two cities, and people, one is the city of the world, one is the city of God. And although we live in the world, but we are not citizens of this world. We are citizens of the other one. Mm-hmm. And so that's Islam, right? It's very much a political system as much as it is a faith. And it's different for Hinduism as well. It's a manner of social organization, right? Mm. There is a hierarchy determined by this faith. Even more so for the so-called Chinese religions like Taoism. And if you look very closely, Taoism did not emerge as a religion in the same sense of the word as we usually use it. So Taoism, it emerged during if I'm not wrong, it's during the spring and autumn period. And that was before the first full empire, the first Qing Empire. Right, and Taoism is actually a political philosophy in response to the instability of that time, because there were lots of, you can say they are like kingdoms, lots of kingdoms fighting each other over China, and Taoism is a retreat from that. It's a desire not to engage in this political bickering, and to retreat and sort of. I don't want to stretch my language here because even the word Tao there's a lot to unpack from that. But it's a manner of engaging with society, not so much a religious faith. While the Chinese faith, the kind of religions that were present in China, at least in its most primitive form, was actually the family religion. It's ancestor worship. So each family has their own set of ancestors that you continue throughout the generations. And you have that even right now among the Chinese, and especially in the Chinese diaspora in Southeast Asia. We still preserve those traditions. My grandma does that, for example. And that was, you can say, the most primitive, the most fundamental kind of faith that is present in China. And it's very domestic, right? It's all in the home. It's not as if others can worship your ancestors in the same way. It wouldn't make sense to them.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah,
well, Christianity is universal. It's for everyone.
Yeah. Well, this raises so much stuff, and I want to carry on this thread, especially with your article on the ancient family and the Christian subversion of it. But this particular relationship that Christianity has to secularism, you can even see secularism as being fostered by Christianity. It's kind of an appendage to Christianity. It feels as though, these other religions, Islam, you're talking of these ancient religions, Taoism, Hinduism, how do you respond to the critique that secularism is essentially an auto-destruct button, and that what Christianity has done in its uniqueness, it's created a beast that's now eating itself. It's something, a tumor has grown out of it that is secularism, that's devouring all of Christianity. And these other religions, Islam, Hinduism, they engage in a far more pragmatic way with the facts of political life, the facts of power, the facts of a political life in a society. So their longevity is guaranteed in a way that has been denied perhaps to Christianity in the West that we're seeing now. What's a rebuttal to that?
Yeah, all right.
I know it's such a big thing to drop.
Yeah, no, it's a good question. It's an excellent one. I will say two things. One is that it's partially true, and the second bit is partially right. So this idea that Christianity created something, and that this child of Christianity denied its provenance in a sense. And this is part of a wider trend, isn't it? I would say since the Enlightenment, really, where Christian values took on a life of its own outside the boundaries of Christianity. So you have things like secularism, the very modern understanding of human rights. You have sexuality, and I can name so many others. And they all come from their Christian roots, but by detaching it from Christianity, it slowly evolves and gains a life of its own. So there is some truth that secularism is very much devouring Christianity in the sense that it sort of restricts Christian faith in some sense, right? For I do know of some countries, and I shall not name them, where Christians can preach to everyone, but they are not allowed to preach to the Muslims. Right, and it's the idea that because the Muslims, for them, this is not allowed. So it's respecting that, but it also denies other freedoms. It denies freedom of conscience right there for the Christians. And freedom of conscience is, again, a very Christian idea. So it's really, in a way, this is Christianity devouring itself, isn't it? It's one arm of it is the right hand devouring the left hand. I would say that's right or wrong. I'm just trying to lay out how I observe things. Although I might disagree with the idea that the other faiths somehow have a certain longevity to them, and how they were able to navigate the political spheres as well, because they have been evolved to adapt to the times.
Right.
And it's not just in the modern period; it's throughout history. I think a very good example, I would say, is actually Buddhism, because when Buddhism went to China, there were several fairly heavy repressions of Buddhism, for the simple reason that Buddhism, like Christianity, had this tradition of monasticism. So there would be people who are convinced of this faith, and they leave their family behind, and they enter the monastery, and they disavow all their earthly possessions, including their own family. And this was extremely destructive to Chinese thought, because for Confucian thought, the family is the most important unit, not the individual. So if a religion pulls people away from that, it destroys this fundamental social unit. And of course, there are many more reasons why these suppressions happened, but this was a key reason. And so Buddhism had to evolve to some extent as well, in the context of Chinese culture. And this was in the pre-modern period. They had to change. You can see it in Islam as well in the modern period. As I'll use the example I mentioned earlier of the idea of democracy or the idea of secularism in Islamic countries, right? Let's say Malaysia. Malaysia is technically a democracy, maybe not a liberal one, but a democracy, and to some extent a degree of secularism. So Islam had to compromise as well. You can see it in countries like the UK or in Singapore, where you have Sharia courts. And the thing about the Sharia traditionally is that, if my understanding is right, the laws of Islam is sovereign over the entire area of jurisdiction. It's not as if it's only for Muslims and not for other people. Right, so in a way they compromise as well. To what extent are they aware of this compromising? I'm not sure, and I'll let them decide on that, since those people of those faiths should be more familiar. Yeah, so what secularism has done really is to, in a way, they brought everyone together peacefully, or theoretically peacefully, but it also expects all faiths to compromise to an extent. Okay, so this is the first bit. Secularism is definitely a form of compromise for all the faiths involved. To what degree they are aware of that, I'm not entirely sure. All right, so the second bit, I wish to refer to, it's a very interesting article by Tom Holland about the end of secularism. And he was pointing to two examples. The first is Turkey's President Erdogan, right? He converted or rather reconverted the Hagia Sophia back into a mosque, right? So the Hagia Sophia was initially it was a church, wasn't it? And it was the seat of the Byzantine Empire. And when the Ottomans conquered it, they converted it into a mosque as a sign of, a triumph of Islam over the Byzantine order. When the Ottomans collapsed, and then you have Ataturk, who built the modern Turkish nation state, and it was turned into a museum because Ataturk was very, very aggressively secular. But then it was reconverted into a mosque by Erdogan, and this was the exact phrase he used. He said, "It is breaking away from the chains of captivity. It was the greatest dream of our youth, and it was the yearning of our people, and it has been accomplished." Right, and what I found interesting about this is that, to what extent Erdogan is speaking for the Turkish people, I do not know, but it does have the underlying assumption that secularism isn't quite compatible with the ideals of Islam. And this is happening in Turkey, one of the most secularized states in the Muslim world, right? And so that's the first example. But the second example was Modi, right? Hindu nationalist, and he often would he went to I can't remember that site really. I think it's called Ayodhya, and essentially it's saying that this is actually a Hindu sacred site, not a Muslim one. And he sort of erased that history. Now, I'm not trying to argue who's right, who's wrong here, or who do these buildings or sites belong to. But what are the consequences of losing secularism? That's what I'm interested in. And there were riots. There were communal violence, at least in India. Not so much in Turkey yet. But in India, there is violence as a result of losing that secular tradition. So secularism is a bit of a mixed bag, isn't it? In a way, it restricts the various faiths, but it also allows for a degree of peace that might not have been there if not for secularism. So Christianity is restricted, but through this restriction by its very own child, it also allowed for some degree of peace. So it's a very mixed legacy right here.
Yeah. I mean, this is, I think it's like one of the biggest issues we have to think about now. I mean, I think pluralism and secularism, they are dying. I think secularism makes promises, but they're half promises. And I think the kind of religion needed to exist in a secular or a pluralist society isn't the real thing, because exclusive claims to truth can't exist in this this form of a disarmament, where everyone agrees to be on the back foot for as long as it happens to be convenient. When you look at how the Ottoman Empire broke down, when you look at it's slightly different, but some stuff in the Balkans. When you look generally, when multiple religions, even the end of Andalusian Spain, when multiple religions exist and they have various degrees, perhaps they're completely equal, perhaps they relate to each other in different ways in one society, it's kind of a civil war that's been frozen. And it's as if you're playing, what's that? I haven't seen the show but I've seen the scene in Squid Game where there's like a Mr. Wolf, where the head turns around and everyone stops. So secularism is like that. The head's turned around, everyone's frozen in place. We all have to, no one's advancing, no one's trying to get advantage over others, but everyone's tiptoeing bit by bit. And the people who have a kind of authority over the mechanism that enforces that secularism often stack the deck in their favor. And often it's not a true form of secularism. I mean, in the West, secularism gives cover to an explicit religion of kind of radical liberalism, basically, which exists as a religion, which has a supremacy over all other faiths. All other faiths have to believe in that before they believe in their own religion and modify their own religion to it. So I think that the future for Christianity, it kind of has to slay its child. Although Christianity may have deep within it different attitudes towards the individual, towards things like this, particularly towards women, all these other issues, towards the family. Ultimately, we need to go back, not revert back, but learn the kind of lessons that a medieval church had, where for all criticisms against it, the Protestants have, it was a church that dominated the society, and it was a church that was pragmatic, and some would criticize it was too ruthless about the facts of power, the facts of politics, the facts of a society. I think secularism is kind of, it's a promise that we can not have ethnic conflict for another generation, another 2 generations, maybe another 300 years. And it's convenient for a kind of managerial state, conveniently, temporarily. But in societies where you have an autocrat, or you have a king, someone who's thinking long term, who passes the society on to their children, it's not useful. That's why it didn't exist in medieval Europe. So I think a kind of a reversion back to harsher truths, more brutal truths, is needed to have a kind of Christianity that is still what it should be, a compassionate, a true religion, but is able to be as brutal as the truths of the world in order to survive to some extent. That's my own thinking on the issue.
I think that last phrase really caught me. The idea that the church needs its own harsh truths to combat the harsh truths of the world. And this is something that is very weak with I don't want to put labels, but you can say it's progressivism, the sort of leftist ideology. It tends to have a view of the world as everyone is just misunderstanding each other. We are all fundamentally good, and we just don't understand. And if we just sat down on the table and talked, everything would be fine.
Exactly. Yeah.
And I'm really afraid the world isn't like an afternoon tea party. It's a very hard conclusion to reach. I took maybe the past 2 days to think about this, and right at night yesterday I just thought, no, there isn't a better one. You need force, because the opponent wants your complete destruction. If you show restraint, it will be perceived as weakness. And it's this sort of harsh truths that liberals don't get, because they don't understand human nature. Because according to scriptures, human nature is evil.
Right.
And if you think human natures are all good, then you'll come to the progressive conclusion. And the world doesn't work this way. The world doesn't reveal itself the way progressives want it to be, much as I want it to be that way.
And and that's the thing. Like, the idea that we can all sit around implies that we have the same goal. It implies also that we have the same frame of reference, that we're even speaking the same language, or that we're orientated within the same civilization, the same society. Even in societies that share common civilizational roots within Europe, the language barriers, the cultural barriers, it implies we're on the same page and we're just disagreeing how to get to the conclusion. One, the conclusion's not set in stone, and two, we're not even on the same page. And this is what all international relations, it's all political philosophy, it's the foundation of it, But there's a real difference. And I think the longevity of Christianity exists in understanding that, in my opinion.
Yeah, I fully agree with that. I think another thing about the liberal, or rather the progressive, I don't like calling them liberal because I think progressivism has departed from liberalism, which is a story for another time, but the progressive idea is that people around the world do share common values enough such that they can come together as a society. And the more I read about various societies, the more I've gone to various countries, the more I'm convinced this is just not true.
Yeah, right.
There are fundamental values that are not coherent, and if two groups of people just come together to form a community, one or the other has to go, or the values have to go, or there will be conflict. So the peace is a compromise piece. It compromises through force, or it compromises through destroying the truth.
Yes. Well, I completely identify with that. I mean, I was raised to be a conservative, but a liberal conservative. So I'd argue it's not like an authentic conservatism. It's not a rightist conservatism. I'm basically I was raised to be a right-wing liberal. I rejected that later, and I was a leftist for a time. But when I was a right-wing liberal, I remember there's a distinct assumption, and it's particular to England, although I'm sure other countries have their own version of it, the idea everyone is English, deep down. Everyone's white, everyone's English, everyone's Christian. And, perhaps they're misguided in this way or that way, but the paternalistic force of the empire will liberate them. And by liberating them, it means turn them into English gentlemen, basically. And it was never spelt out explicitly, but it's an assumption. And I think it was an assumption particular to a kind of Anglican missionary attitude, which worked in tandem with a kind of colonial form of supremacism, like a universalist liberal form of supremacism from the British Empire. And of course, living abroad in other countries, living in London, speaking to other people, really understanding, studying other cultures and religions, you just realize this is a delusion of a class of people who think they're still in charge of the world, basically. In a particular British context. Although Americans have their own kind of version of it. The idea that deep down everyone's an American. France have their own version of it with their colonies, as long as you speak French, you're one of us. The understanding deep philosophical issues around what it is to even be a person here on this earth, our relations to our communities, these things, they're all trivialized, they're all undermined, they're all washed down, and some of them won't wash, some of them won't be boiled down, other than through violence. And that's a very harsh reality. But that's kind of the reality that Pope Urban had to deal with when he was responding to jihad. This is something that it's within the Christian tradition to deal with these harsh truths, these harsh realities.
Yeah, exactly. You don't sit at the same. You don't have a cup of tea with the person pointing a gun at you. Yeah.
Yeah. In fact, I think that happens in Phileas Fogg.
Yeah, exactly. I think all civilizations have a bit of that, what you mentioned, because most of the examples you gave, in France and Britain and America, this idea that everyone's a secret American behind the cover of their skin, right? And you do see that in East Asia as well. We often think that even if we think that people are not like us, we will try to convert them to this way of thinking. It's almost evangelical sometimes.
Right.
Yeah, I think one of the bigger, yeah, you right, this idea of certain cultures being fundamentally clashing. It's something that you can see between the Chinese familial tradition, so this idea of ancestor worship that I mentioned, and the Christian faith. So if you look at countries in Southeast Asia, when the third or the fourth generation of ethnic Chinese who came from China, so it's maybe 3, 4, 5, 6 generations in Southeast Asia, some of them converted to Christianity at a certain point, probably in the last, I would say, 40 to 60 years. And what you will see is a degree of hostility to that. And it's not, at first I didn't understand it because I internalized Christian assumptions. I believed in freedom of conscience. I can choose whatever religion I want to believe in. Why are they so against it? Why are the Buddhists or the Taoists, why are they so against Christians, rather ethnic Chinese, turning into Christians? And actually, it only made sense when I studied about the ancient family. Because for the ancient family, preserving that ancestral worship is so important. In fact, it's probably more important than the individuals within that family, because the loss of that ancestry comes with the ending of the family. So once the family line ended, it means that this ancestral worship for this whole family line across generations would be completely obliterated. So there's this need to preserve the family. And that's why family is so important in East Asian culture. When Christianity came along, the people who became Christians effectively gave up that ancestral worship tradition. And of course, I recognize there are some Christians who syncretize these two together. We still follow these rituals, but we are also Christians. But you see, there's compromise there already. And I'm not saying who's right, who's wrong. I'm just pointing out that this is happening, and it is what it is. And that's why there is a sort of fundamental clash there. It's not as superficial as it first appears. It's not a simple matter of we don't really understand each other. If we talk about it, things will get better. In fact, usually the opposite happens. When we talk about it or try to reconciliate these two ideas, what happens is these two ideas get pulled back. The family tradition needs to compromise and views its own family tradition as less important, views its ancestor worship as less important. And same for the Christians. They have to compromise a bit. They have to say, I think it's okay to continue venerating these, venerating maybe my great-grandparents who passed. Yeah, and both religions have to pull back. So that whole dialogue that happens, that whole reconciliation process is actually working out how to compromise best.
Yeah. And this reminds me of two things. One is, have you seen the movie Silence from Martin Scorsese?
I've read the book, but not the movie.
Oh, right. Okay, so you probably know more than I do. I've just seen the movie. But there's some themes there around the relationship that it has to the Japanese religion, and the scene in the movie where the guy reveals he was a Christian, but he realized that the soil in Japan doesn't allow the tree of Christianity to grow, and that's, you know, the fact that the protagonist is incapable of accepting that, of understanding that. There's a certain naivety. I'm not sure how it's played out in the book, but in the movie he's portrayed with a certain naivete around that issue. The second is, do you know the author Sally Rooney?
I don't.
So it's like, it's trash, but it's like Marxist young adult fiction, and loads of critics say that it's like the most genius thing ever. But in her latest book, there's some scene, and a friend of mine was talking about it, where it's she was using it because she's a professor of philosophy, and she studied at Notre Dame. She was using a scene in this to relate to her students, and it's where someone goes to a Catholic church in Ireland, and they're like thrown into a crisis because they understand for the first time when they go there that the people believe it unironically. So they don't believe it metaphorically, they don't believe it ironically, they don't believe it with caveats, they don't believe it underneath another belief, they're not embarrassed of believing it. It's in a world saturated by irony, like the contemporary West, by everything in quotations, everything separated through a lens, being watched, things like this. That level of sincere, authentic faith, it can feel perverted and it can feel alien to many people who aren't exposed to it. So there's an assumption particularly among secular Westerners, that people can't really believe it. They can't really believe it. And maybe some of the Christians who come into a society, they think these people, they can't really believe with their whole being that their ancestors are real, and that they're a real thing that they're worshipping. Just like many in the modern West, they can't really understand that Christianity really believe it as a fact. It's not something on faith, it's not a series of metaphors that help them understand the world, it's not this or that. They genuinely believe it. And I think that's one of the things that's so attractive in a world of fakery, to find something so authentic as that. But it can also as well be something that's deeply disturbing and deeply alienating. Because if it were true, it would change so much of your life, and it also meant that you couldn't get along. You couldn't partake in a kind of coincidence of interests, that there may be conflict. Not necessarily violent, but maybe with family, maybe with friends in future.
Yeah.
So instinctually, a lot of people are repelled by that.
Yeah, exactly. In fact, I would say the exact opposite of what maybe the contemporary West would feel, which is that Christianity is more true than everything around us. Right? The computer I'm using to speak to you is a form of simulation, isn't it? I'm not speaking to you face to face. It is through this filter. And of course you are there. I'm not being a Descartes and saying, well, I don't know what exists outside my own head. But there is this sense that Christianity is more true than the things around us. And I mean that in the sense that it's not just a belief that I hold, but it's core to my identity. It's the framework in which I view the outside world.
Mm-hmm.
And it's quite similar to what C.S. Lewis said. I don't believe in the sun just because it's right there in the sky and I see it, but rather it is through the sun that I see the world around me.
Mm-hmm.
And I think Christianity is a bit like that. At least for me, it's perceiving the world through a Christian lens. And it's like a computer, right? You have programs and you can delete programs. But if you delete the operating system, the computer is just a shell, because that's what makes it the computer. And Christianity is the operating system right there, and it should be the one for all Christians. And it's not just a belief that, oh, after navigating some evidence, I've decided that atheism is correct or something like that.
Right.
It's the problem with the, or I'm changing topics, but it's a problem with the atheist epistemology. It treats religious beliefs as if they are scientific phenomenon and should be studied as if they are that. But the reverse is true. Christianity is more like the philosophy of science or the method of science that gives rise to those beliefs. And so they got it the whole way round. It's really the reverse. It's the values that come first, and then seeing the world through that. And it doesn't mean that Christianity can't be challenged. It can be, and I think I've done a fair bit of that. But the very fact of people challenging Christianity as Christians directly comes from the Christian faith, because the Christian faith is very introspective. It's always looking at itself, right? So this idea of deconstruction, again, one of those Christian instincts, but derailed from Christianity, right? You're deconstructing Christianity, but this act of deconstructing it's supposed to be self-appraisal, right? And it could only have come from the Christian faith. And somehow
confession.
Yeah, exactly, right. Yeah, it came from that, from the idea of confession. And when it's taken within a secular context and deconstructing Christianity, it loses its meaning. And you don't see this in, say, you don't see have you seen a deconstruction movement in, say, Shintoism?
No.
Exactly. It emerged in the West for a reason, right? It's this idea of introspection, the individual, which is not necessarily present in all other cultures.
Yeah. I think that the way you describe it, where you say, without it, you're left with a shell. I mean, that seems so apt for what goes on in the West. We tried Christianity without the Christianity, and what's left is a shell. And that, rather than it being a fact contained within the world, it's a kind of metaphysical ground of being that meaning sits on top of. And you can see that when that's taken away, what do people have? They have very, very degraded cults that are ubiquitous. We're not all rational automatons that's been promised. We just worship. We worship products. We worship all other forms of idols. And that heart of the West is Christianity, and without it, you can see the West is being liquidated, like physically liquidated in the people that consist of it, and spiritually and culturally liquidated too.
Yeah, what you said at the end, that Christianity is the heart of the West. There is a quote by T.S. Eliot, and he said, "It is in Christianity that our arts have developed. It is in Christianity that the laws of Europe, until recently, have been rooted. It is against the background of Christianity that all of our thought has significance. An individual European may not believe that the Christian faith is true, yet what he says and makes and all that he does spring out of his heritage of Christian culture and depend upon that culture for its meaning." And he said something quite prescient, quite prophetic even. "I do not believe that the culture of Europe could survive the complete disappearance of the Christian faith. And I am convinced of that, not merely because I am a Christian myself, but as a student of social biology. If Christianity goes, the whole culture goes."
Well, I think that's a really nice quote to end on.